This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak about my PhD. I'm doing this in English, but I've left the quotations in French. If anybody is not at ease with quotations that were originally in French, let me know and I'll translate. I would like to kick off today with one of my favorite quotations by Marcel Mauss. Actually, why can we not see the... Oh dear. Oh well, never mind. It does say where it's from. A quotation by Marcel Mauss. Les troupes anglaises avec lesquelles j'étais ne savaient pas se servir de bêches françaises, ce qui obligeait à changer 8000 bêches par division pour nous relevions une division française et inversement. By way of an argument about the adaptation of the human body to the tools at its disposition, he places us right at the heart of the topic for this evening, the low-level functioning of the Allied coalition, far below high command talks. After centuries of hereditary enmity, 1914 saw 100,000 old contemptibles, and then many, many more soldiers after that, go to war alongside France, taking part in the gradual transformation of warfare with the establishment of trenches. Previous work on the Allied coalition has tended to be based on the memoirs of those who participated in the high command negotiations, and tends to reach the conclusion that misunderstandings and distrust were rife between the French and the British. This always intrigued me, because if there were so many problems, if no one trusted anyone, how did they manage not only to maintain a functioning coalition for the whole duration of the war, but also win in the end with the Americans? The mentions of on-the-ground cooperation are rare and far between, but when we do find them, they put us on the right track for this inquiry. Two examples. Elizabeth Greenhalgh writes, I quote, "The easy practical matters were attended to. Interpreters on the quayside to aid disembarkation of British troops, for example. But the true binding together of Allied operations was entirely missing in 1914 and 1915. That does, of course, raise the question of just how easy the practical questions were. Benjamin Cooling makes a similar point when he writes, I quote, "In fact, it was primarily at functional levels that British and French combat and support units received the greatest opportunity to enhance genuine Allied cooperation, totally apart from the elaborate use of professional liaison personnel like the redoubtable Major Edward Spears. But up to now there has been a distinct lack of studies on Allied coalition warfare on the lower echelons, with only partial aspects covered so far." In order, however, to engage in a serious, in-depth study of the Allied functioning at war, we need to consider the military coalition as an object. And it's a difficult object for the historian, very much a blind spot for military historians, who tend to be the last bastion of national historiographical tradition, also archival tradition. And they're also conceptually awkward, because the traditional approaches such as comparative history, cultural transfer, quickly show their limits when we look at a coalition which is so closely linked and interacts so closely. Our object, the Allied coalition in its lower echelons, actually contains two separate but closely linked research questions. The first, which may seem more natural to historians, asks us about the reasons for the success of the Allied coalition on the ground, in particular through the daily routine of handling everyday matters. The second, which occurs more readily to those who study languages and communication, asks the basic question of how was communication possible between British soldiers and French civilians and French soldiers, which logistical, practical solutions were adopted to overcome the language gap. Over the time during which I worked on my PhD, I realized that depending on my public, I tended to address one or the other question. One with First World War historians, and the other with specialists on translation and interpreting, which I frequented through a series of conferences and a summer school. It was only when I really settled down to writing up the PhD that I realized I needed to find a way to combine these two questions if I really wanted to get at my object. And which is why I've decided I can label it Histoire croisée. Because answering only one of those questions would be to miss the subject entirely. If I were to write a purely logistical history of the Allied coalition, that would be to contribute to a very well-established but ultimately frustrating school of historical writing, in which communication and languages are completely absent, and no mention is made of the conditions in which individuals accomplish the feats described, and there are many, many of these studies, answering only the language question, that is to say, how do the French and the British talk to each other, would produce yet another case of what Anthony Pym, a translation specialist, has called archaeology, in that we accumulate knowledge about language use in the past without using this important knowledge to answer actual questions in history. I haven't got time in this introduction to go in detail into the sources which I used in order to complete this study, and I've tried to include a wide variety of examples of my sources in this presentation, so hopefully you'll get an idea of the kind of material I used. But very briefly, it's a lot of it, the main body of, for a large part of it, comes from the Service Historique de la Défense in Vincennes. I've got considerable material from the National Archives in Kew and the American National Archives in Washington, a certain amount of material from the Imperial War Museum, and then quite a lot of documents from private collections. I spent quite a lot of time on my PhD, and for over the years I kept meeting people who said, oh, I think one of my ancestors was a military interpreter, and I managed to get hold of interesting documents that I might not have had otherwise through private collections, essentially. Now, let me get on to the next one. This is my outline briefly. I'm going to look at first look at basically the pre-1914 preparation. What were the French and British armies doing in terms of preparation for a coming war, as far as language training was concerned. Then I look at 1914, entering coalition warfare, first contacts, what happens when these plans from before the war actually meet reality. Then I will look on the one hand at what I call friendly occupation, which is basically the vivre ensemble behind the front lines, where in the British zone of the front line, where troops that weren't in the front line were in French villages in contact with French civilians, which is a large part of the things that I looked into. And then I will also look at the fighting together side of it. It says 15 to 17. It will include bits from before and after that as much as I can. And then 1918, I will wrap it all up. It says changing warfare in the sense of, one, the arrival of the American troops, which changes a certain number of things as far as languages on the Western Front are concerned. And 1918, also the year when the war of movement starts again, which again means very different things for language infrastructure. I'm going to have to be fairly brief. I've tried to include enough elements to make it all clear. I've got a lot more material, so if you have any questions or you think I didn't explain part of it, please ask questions afterwards. I have a lot more material, but I can't show it all today. Now, languages in military preparation. This is basically thinking about the 19th century, thinking about the pre-war period, early 20th century. And I'm not going to go into great depth on this, but there are some things which are just important for you to be able to understand what happens during the First World War. Looking at military language strategies at any given point in history is actually a fascinating indicator, because what a given army is planning in the way of language teaching tells us a lot of what they think the next war might be. And it's not something which has been studied in any great depth. The French and British armies actually had very different, and I'll get to this later, but practically binary opposite military language strategies during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I'll just go over them very briefly. On the French side, we have the development of a professional corps of interprètes militaires inside the French army that have their origin, or at least they like to trace their own origin back to the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt, where there were a certain number of military interpreters that were called this. And that's something which then again appears in the 1830s with the conquest of Algeria. And throughout the 19th century, the French develop a professional system of military interpreting. They're recruited by concours, and so it becomes quite a large-scale system. That's basically for Arabic. And then in 1884, a second branch of this French military language strategy is put in place. Remembering the 1870 campaign against Prussia, a decision was made to assemble a body of interprètes militaires de réserve for European languages, specifically German, Spanish, and Italian. So rather than having professional military interpreters on the ground in Algeria, these ones were to be reserve officers, so people who had another job but who could be called up to serve as interpreters. And these were again selected by competitive exam, and I'll show you examples of the actual exam they passed in a second when we've got past the British side. So this meant that using these two different recruitment modes, so both for the Arabic language and then for the European languages, the French army could essentially micromanage the number of language specialists at its disposal, indicating how many speakers of German it would want to have on its list at any given time, which gives us an interesting idea of what kind of expectations of war they had at the time. The British military language strategy at the same time, in the run-up to the First World War, is completely different. It consists of qualifying regular officers in languages. So what they did was they took the normal British officers and they could, on a voluntary basis, pass language exams, at which point they were on a special list as interpreters. So rather than having individuals who are qualified just for language tasks, we're looking at officers who also happen to be qualified in languages, which is a very different choice of language strategy. Another interesting fact is the officers could put themselves forward for a language or several languages of their choosing. It's the Civil Service Commission that runs these exams. All they had to do was write in a couple of months beforehand and say, I would like to pass the exam for this language, and that was what they could do. So that means we can then draw up... Yes, we can then draw up lists. This is a contemporary list from the period of people being examined for the different languages. So we've got Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, Turkish, Danish, Dutch, French, German, Greek, Hausa, Italian, Romanian, Portuguese, Spanish, Swahili, Norwegian, and Swedish, with varying numbers throughout the years. And this is the result of people putting themselves forward for languages. It says languages with rewards. I won't go into the details of this because the British Army did try to get a handle on encouraging languages it thought it might actually need rather than having lots of interpreters for Swedish. By offering rewards. That's a bit complicated to get into, but there was a tentative attempt to create more interpreters for languages which they felt would be more useful. So when we go through the army lists, which are the official records of the British officers at any given time, there are lists in these of officers who have qualified as interpreters for any given year. So I went through the army lists for all the years where we can find interpreters and compiled these statistics, which shows an even wider range of languages, including some fairly unlikely ones, and gives you an idea of the kind of languages that are being covered, which we can see quite clearly come from a British colonial experience, but not exclusively, because we repeatedly find Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish. So it's a very wide range of languages and something which has very little official direction to it. Now, once I had established these numbers of interpreters per language, I can then draw up another set of statistics which basically shows us the numbers of interpreters for French, German and Russian at any given time from 1890 to 1914, which interestingly shows us that until just about the turn of the century, Russian is ahead of the other languages, which is something which experts of the 19th century British Army don't find surprising at all, because Russia being considered the threat to the British possessions in India, Russian was obviously a language which was encouraged, and which then, with the decline of the perceived threat of the Russian Empire to the Indian possessions, then declines afterwards. The massive increase of French in 1914 actually has to do with the reward system, because they invent a new kind of reward, which means a lot of people, I suspect, who had French but hadn't passed the exam, went to pass it in 1914, which explains why we then end up with far more people qualified in French than we had beforehand. But that's not just that's to do with the exam system changing. Now, when we look at the exams that got people to be interpreters, this is the French one, 1910. for European languages. So this is for German, Spanish, Italian, for reserve officers. And it has a written exam, which is the translation of what they call passage d'auteur militaire ou de règlement. So this is military texts, translation without a dictionary. Oral exam, which is faire preuve de connaissances suffisantes pour prendre un renseignement auprès des habitants, interroger les prisonniers, les déserteurs, pour lire des correspondances ou des documents plus ou moins mal écrits, pour interpréter les abréviations usuelles, pour dépouiller les journaux, expliquer les affiches, etc. These are intelligence tasks. Of all the many ways of language learning you could do, clearly what the French were looking for in their reserve officers for German and other European languages were intelligence tasks, which is not that surprising, but that's clearly what they were being recruited for. There was an oral exam, which was an oral military exam. So it was about knowledge of French military law, essentially. So that was the language one. Épreuve d'équitation ou de bicyclette, and probably get back to that afterwards when I get to the First World War, how important that turned out to be. And, oops, sorry, I don't know why this isn't going properly. And then there was an appréciation de l'aptitude générale du candidat, yes. Now, if we look at the 1907 guidelines for Britain, it was a conversation oral. There was an exam which consisted of reading manuscripts where they had to read notes in the foreign language and dictate answers to those. Then there was an exam on technical terms, knowledge of technical, military and local terms, including titles of local officials and terms of etiquette in dealing with them, terms used in travel, reconnaissance, transport duties, collection of supplies, etc. Tended to be tested by direct question and by oral translation from a British or foreign training manual. So it's again a question of translation of military texts, but with a very much wider range of possible uses. We're going far beyond just intelligence tasks if we're looking at how to address local elites and how to deal with them. Then why does this not work? And then when we get to the written exam, it's again a far wider range of tasks. Translation into English, translation from English, dictation, translation from manuscript, letter, writing a private or official letter in the language apprécié being given. Then an interesting translation task where they are read a task in the foreign language and then they have to write down a translation of it. And then a composition task where they have to write, where it's basically the other way around. They are read a text in English and they have to write it down in the foreign language. So interestingly modern, I thought, exam techniques, very much applied and very much applied to the kind of positions that an officer in the British colonial army, a British colonial police force, would be likely to face. But it shows how different language exams at practically the same time can be and how much they show us the different kind of language tasks they were preparing people for. Right, now what happens when we're running up towards the First World War? We've got these two armies that have got very different language training facilities. You will note that the French army had no provision for teaching English. The British army had provisions for qualifying people as interpreters for French, but we'll get to what use that actually was later. And the interesting thing about the Allied coalition in the First World War is that it was a rare case in military history of a war being prepared beforehand and successfully prepared. Usually cases of pre-war periods are long histories of people getting things wrong and people missing the important bit. The language case is actually, for a variety of reasons, a case where the preparation before the war was very thorough and very effective. It starts in 1905 and 1906, where there were secret negotiations. They couldn't be public because as long as the British Parliament hadn't agreed to go to war, there couldn't be official negotiations on this. But basically the French military attaché in London did a lot of this work, and they covered a wide range of topics such as planning for various landing points, where would British troops land if they came, includes communications arrangements, and it has very early on, 1905, 1906, the decision of two modes of communication there will be liaison officers who will be detached between equivalent structures of the two armies. So the idea is to basically swap officers between headquarters. And the other provision of, I quote, non-commissioned officers of the French Reserve mounted on bicycles who will be attached to each unit of the British Army to act as interpreters or orderlies. I'm not going to go into big detail of this, but the fact that they're called interpreters or orderlies is interesting, because an orderly is something which we see appearing practically it's the military training manuals around the Boer War that have this term. An orderly is someone who can do all sorts of tasks. It's a very vague notion. An orderly could be a native that we recruit on the ground, but it could also be someone from the British Army. And when negotiations resume in 1911, it's basically we get two rounds of negotiations, one for each Morocco crisis. So when in 1911 negotiations resume about what would happen if the British Army came to France, this general agreement that the French will be providing interpreters and orderlies of some kind goes into far more detail. And so we end up then with numbers being drawn up of how many interpreters and how many officers would be needed for the various structures of the British Army that would be coming over. So that's the French side of the negotiations as it's conserved in the archives in Vincennes, which shows fairly obvious things like, for example, cavalry units needing far more interpreters than any other kind of unit, because as they're mobile, they tended to be scouts ahead of any given army, so they would need more interpreters. So we can find this sort of thing. And once this had been agreed, how many interpreters were going to be needed, the French army could then go about thinking how they were going to provide these. And this was the decision that was made. There were several regiments from the French army. So you can see they're based in Lille, Rouen, and Paris. And you can see their names across the top. They would provide these either rank soldiers or non-commissioned officers who would be attached to the British Army. And so what these regiments do is they draw up from the people they know they will be mobilizing, they draw up lists of people who would be suitable. Secret lists. None of these individuals were warned before the First World War that this was what they were going to be doing. They all discover it when they mobilized in August 1914. And what then? Oh yes. So what we've got at the moment of mobilisation is lists of people who will become interpreters but who have no prior training and who haven't been told that this will happen. I was very lucky because the archives in Vincennes have got details on all of the interpreters who were attached to Le Havre, so that's 2,748 or something. So I was actually able to come up with a database of who these interpreters were and where they came from, which means that we can, for example, we can have statistics on where they came from, which is an interesting point on French social history if you want, because who in France in 1914 spoke English? When I set out working on this topic, I thought I would have intellectuals and English teachers, and I was very wrong. I had all sorts of professions and an awful lot of people who had learnt English through travel or through trade. People who'd worked in cafes in Manchester, or who'd been missionaries in India, or who did all sorts of weird and wonderful jobs beforehand. Short or long travel. Some people who'd lived abroad for 20 years and who came back on mobilisation. So the interpreters throughout the war, wide range of professional and social backgrounds, and a very good spread of geographic origin. When you look at that map, you see a certain bias towards large cities, but apart from that, the spread is fairly wide across the country. The rural areas are underrepresented, but apart from that, we see interpreters coming from a lot of different places, which is something which is reflected from their social background. A lot of different professional backgrounds could lead to people becoming interpreters. Now, yes. Very briefly, I said they come from very different professional backgrounds. I said they were either non-commissioned officers, sous-officiers, or the vast majority, especially later on, were rank soldiers. This had a lot of consequences for what they did during the war. I can't go into all the details, but I like using this picture to explain it. This is a later picture in the war. This is early 1916. You can see in the French helmet. On the left-hand side, on the bigger horse, we have a French military interpreter. Now you can't see from where you are, but he's wearing a very curious hybrid uniform. He's wearing British uniform with a French helmet and special insignia with a sphinx. I'll tell you about the sphinx later if I have time. A sphinx on each collar, and this is an interest. I was able to trace who he. This is a postcard actually, which I found, but I was able to trace who he is. He'd been a primary school teacher before the war. His mother was a native speaker of English, and so he had English from home. And so he ends up being an interpreter during the First World War. This picture is interesting because it shows him with his manservant, because as an interpreter he was entitled to a horse, like a British officer. And as someone who had a horse, he was entitled to a manservant who would then look after his horse. He was not an officer though. So he sends home this picture to show basically the rank that he had acquired as an interpreter, which was not a military rank as such, but because of his function as an interpreter, he was allowed a horse. And I like this picture a lot because it shows him at such a height above his manservant on a slightly smaller horse. It's an interesting fact, and I get back to the points that this raises. The fact that for the French military interpreters, their position on a horse dealing with British officers didn't equal their military rank. They were not officers, which has a lot of interesting consequences on how they work and what work they do. Right. I'm going to go briefly into what happens when the two very different cultures meet, but I just wanted to make a mini conclusion before I get actually into the war about the very different but complementary systems that I talked about. I explained how the British officers could be qualified in languages and how there was a tradition of orderlies who, in most cases, especially in colonial warfare, tended to be locally recruited natives, whereas the French had a tradition of recruiting professionals for language tasks. So you can see how this system, which was agreed upon to have French ranked soldiers or non-commissioned officers attached to British units, is something which made sense to both systems, which is one of the reasons I think it worked quite well. To the British, being given a French native to sort out the language problems is something which made sense as a military choice, and to the French to decide within the French citizen army who would have these specialist tasks, again, was a logical choice. Now, what happens when these two very different worlds meet? The next day, the 13th of August 1914, we arrived very early at Le Havre in a blazing sun. As we came in, the French soldiers tumbled out of their barracks and came to cheer us. Our men had never seen foreign uniforms before and roared with laughter at their colours. Stephen Burton of the Coldstream Guards rebuked his men. He said, "These French troops are our allies. They are going to fight with us against the Germans." Whereupon one man said, "Poor chaps, they deserve to be encouraged," and took off his cap and waved it and shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" He was a bit behind the times. I believe if the Germans beat us and invaded England, they would still be laughed at in the villages as ridiculous foreigners. Right, so this was first encounters of one kind. There are actually lots of fascinating accounts of first contacts. A lot of them tend to be by the military interpreters who were standing on the quaysides waiting for the British boats to arrive. And there's one fact that I'm still working on, but I still can't quite figure it out. There's a lot of reciprocal singing of national anthems. You get the French interpreters get very good at singing "God Save the Queen" every time a boat arrives. But more interestingly, quite often they will get a Marseillaise back from the British boat. So there's a lot of interesting first contact at this point. But the one I really wanted to show you was another thing of first contact, which is this one. There was no leave from the billet for the first day. They had just arrived in Le Havre. But it was besieged by all the children of the neighbourhood, and they ran errands for the men. It was funny to hear the attempts made to make the children understand what was required. Even Hindustani was used. One fellow was overheard saying to a native, note the word, "Here, Madame Backer." When I first saw this, I thought, well, unlikely, amusing, we shall see. It's actually something which recurs in I've got a lot of accounts of people saying, especially at the beginning of the war, men trying to use Hindustani in France. We can call it a colonial hangover, we can call it men using the language skills they have acquired on their travels. It's an interesting one. It's what do we do when we come to a new language situation which we haven't met yet, we probably use the language skills we had acquired beforehand. In general, when I'm looking at language use, actual language use rather than provision of interpreters, I have to rely on these kind of testimonies of looking at people telling me what people said, which as language to do your analysis on is very second hand. Which is why I was very pleased to find a source which means I can get more to grips with language. It's an indirect source, but then all my sources are indirect. One of the things I wondered about was how language changes. If we look at, language 1914, first contacts, and then we look at how it changes throughout the First World War. And I was very lucky. I found a series of dictionaries by a guy called Eugène Plumont, who was an interpreter himself and who ran a very lucrative business of editing dictionaries, word guidebooks, originally for French interpreters, and they then got sold to both officers and interpreters throughout the First World War. And the really interesting bit is that the very first one is from October 1914, and they then get re-edited and amplified throughout the war. So you get successive editions, and so I went through all of these and looked at what changed throughout the war. And so this is what it looks like. That's the 1917 edition. And so this is 1914. It has a great section on sort of everyday life, and that includes, for example, footwear. And by the time we get to 1917, footwear has become far more detailed, essentially because the British Army has a wide range of different kinds of boots for which we need to find French equivalents. So that one's quite amusing, but more significant. If we look at what the translations of another item of clothing, what do we do about translations of coats? The French officer's capote, the coat, is not at all the same thing as a British officer's greatcoat, but that's the decision that is made at that point. That's how they're translated. And by the time we get to 1917, we've got a very different choice of translation. It says capote féminin, sort of greatcoat in the French army. So we're looking at a word guide for interpreters, which evolves from which clearly hasn't stood the test of daily life, and evolves to be a sort of more a guide, par-dessus cours pour officier, British warm, something which gives a lot more contextual information rather than just giving cultural equivalents. It starts to give a lot more contextual information and shows sort of the very day-to-day tasks that these interpreters were needed to do. And then the one thing that I was really looking for, and that really worked as well, is to look at the kind of words that were included in 1914 and the kind of words that are included in 1917. And the 1914 dictionary has an extensive section on camping, essentially. L'emplacement d'un camp, lever le camp, toile sur laquelle on s'étend pour dormir, which is not at all surprising considering, this was done, it came out in October 14, so it was essentially compiled in September 14. There's a big discussion between historians whether people at the time actually thought the war was going to be short, but I suspect this guy really did think the war was going to be short. And by the time we get to 1917, the camping section has been reduced to a bare minimum, and instead we end up with lots of technical details, billets de logement avec nourriture, billets de logement avec nourriture partielle. We're now looking at an army which is living its daily life behind the front lines in cantonnement with in French houses and homes, and so we need a completely new vocabulary as the war changes, which is something which is not that surprising considering the history of the war, but it's good to be able to see it in the daily language use. Now, if we look, this brings us neatly into this question of friendly occupation. Communication, be that in war or in peace, between individuals who speak the same languages or across a linguistic or a cultural divide, always needs to be situated. It's very easy, especially considering this topic, to sort of pick out examples. You can get compilations of the kind of French that the British soldiers spoke. And they're a very difficult source because they tend not to be situated. You have no idea how these words were used. So I tried to spend quite a lot of time on situating communication on the Western Front. This is December 1914, just to show you the starting point. The orange bits are the British units, and that then expands further down as the British successively take over bits of what was at that point still held by the French positions in blue. So what we're looking at is the area behind the British lines. So what happens in this area? What are people speaking? Well, I like this picture a lot. This is from 6th of September 1914, very early on in the war, taken on a street somewhere in northern France. On this picture we have a selection of British officers, one of them who was clearly a driver, and this is the interesting guy who, as you can see by the different headgear, is the French interpreter. French interpreters had képi throughout the whole war, either the French helmet or the French képi throughout the whole war. You can always pick out an interpreter on a picture because he's the one with the other headgear. And it's actually entitled Officier anglais déjeunant avec un interprète français. They didn't even pick up on the cultural stereotype. It's not really déjeunant. They are actually drinking tea. But I like this picture because it shows us it shows us the situations of presence of British troops in the centre of a village. I mean, they must have been, I suspect the unit was probably stopped in the village, and I get accounts of this, the officers saying they wanted to stop for a meal, they wanted to stop for something, and they couldn't afford to go very far because they didn't know when the unit would be leaving, so they had to, basically stop in the middle of the city. So what usually happened was that they then went into a farm and asked for a table and chairs and got them, and then were able to have whatever meal they wanted to have. Now, obviously, who has to do the asking? The asking is always the interpreter. So that's one of the very first situations of contact and negotiations in a village. Happens like this. And when I look at this picture, I always like to show this one. I shall just go backwards and forwards twice. This one is from an illustration from 1917 from the Memoirs of an Interpreter, which is trying to show, using practically the same disposition. I'm convinced that the person who did that drawing knew the photograph. I can't prove it, but I'm fairly certain. Trying to show something very different. This is a British officer's mess, which is something which I've done quite a lot of work on, but I can't go into now. British officer's mess, which is a very special space on the Western Front because it's a British island to a certain extent, where a lot of traditions, be they in food, be they in anything else, are perpetuated, but it's also a space which is very much open on the surrounding world. Quite often local elites of various kinds get invited to the British officer's mess. So there is constant exchange, but the interesting thing on this one is that the message that it's trying to send, it says "Un début au messe des officiers." So this is the French interpreter, who is sitting practically in the same position as on this picture, but what it's trying to get across is basically the cultural gap between them. Him and the British officers. You can see them at the other side of the table, looking at him slightly suspiciously. So we're looking at similar but same people, but they're very different spaces and very different configurations. Now, I'm not going to go into the estaminet, which is one of the important points where language and communication obviously happens. But if I go into the estaminet now, I'm never going to have time to finish. But what happens in estaminet are the sort of informal attempts at communication, the kinds that I really wanted to get at and that are even harder to get hold of than most of the other kinds of communication that I try to work on. And this is the sort of thing that I get in letters. People will say the French phrases that Tommy uses, no bon, n'a plus, il n'y a plus, compris. Those are the three classics. Those are the ones that I find in many a letter, many a memoir. People will say these are the expressions that people used. And I have an example, for example, of a French interpreter who says rien de plus drôle que la façon dont les Anglais et leurs hôtes arrivent à s'entendre et se comprendre dans leur rapport quotidien. Vous supposez que la conversation se résume en une mimique plus ou moins expressive. Quelle erreur! De véritables entretiens se déroulent entre Tommy et la population civile. Après l'obligatoire période de tâtonnement, tout un code s'est établi qui permet de converser à souhait. Une sorte de dialecte a été créé. Il se compose de quelques expressions dérivées de deux langues en présence, agrémentées d'une variété de mots nouveaux forgés pour les besoins de la cause. Langage bizarre, à la portée seulement de ceux qui le pratiquent ou en sont les quotidiens auditeurs. The interpreter is actually a great source on this because as language practitioners, they were obviously very interested in this sort of thing happening, so they tend to be very good at telling us about this. And so I get lots of accounts of these expressions. Sometimes there's a few more, but those are the ones that tend to appear. And then occasionally you get accounts of slightly more detailed exchanges. I'm not going to read all of that to you, but that's the kind of exchange that I hear about. Now, it's the kind of thing that's very difficult to use in history because I can't quantify it, I can't situate it, I can't prove anything. But it's an interesting case of, if we note, presence of a foreign army for a prolonged period in a country could have led to any number of situations. There were French civilians who learned English. A certain number of people, especially if you were running the local estaminet, a certain number of people did end up with conversational English, which enabled them to sell things. But the fact that a lot of the communication, rather than happening in English, which it could well have, happened in this sort of what I have contemporaries who call it a sabir, sort of an exchange language, is an interesting thing, and I think, but it's a difficult one to prove, I think it's something to do with the special temporality of war. We're not looking at a colonial situation where you arrive and there's a finality, you're going to stay or you're not going to stay. We're looking at something which wasn't expected to last. So we're looking at temporary solutions to problems which then last a lot longer than they might have been expected to last. Oh, this is a great one. This is from the materials given by a French interpreter to the Imperial War Museum. There's a French interpreter who after the war went and lived in England, and this is a piece of paper that he conserved from his experience of the war. The British officers gave him this because the cuisinier was French and he persisted in cooking them things they didn't like. So this was the piece of paper he was given, and he was then to explain to the cuisinier that they liked their peas dry with little melted butter, they wanted no onion, new potatoes dry with little melted butter, mint, not onion, fish dry fried with breadcrumbs, no onion. Onions are to be served separately and not mixed in anything. This clearly amused the interpreter who kept the piece of paper, but it's one of the many cases of interpreter-mediated exchange on the Western Front, and it seems, it's hilarious when we read it like that, but it's daily creature comforts that have a big impact on the experience of the First World War, so it's more important than we might think it is. Now, I'm going to skip that one, and I might come back to it if I have time afterwards, otherwise we'll never get round to fighting together. Fighting together, I've talked at not that much length, but as much length as I can, about the experience behind the front lines, the British troops in French villages, what happened there. But obviously that's not all of what I need to talk about if I'm talking about languages on the Western Front. Fighting together is actually even harder to do source-wise than the living together behind the front lines. And I've chosen two, I like to call them case studies, for this section, because I think that's probably the best way to get a grip on the sort of language exchanges that happened on the Western Front. We'll start with this one. This is a sketch by a interpreter, so he's French, attached to a British unit, and he sends this home in a letter where he describes what he does, and he sends it home to his mother with the sketch. Now this is something which should clearly never have got through postal censorship. Thankfully, clearly the censor wasn't very switched on that day, so it has made it through to us. And what we can see here is a sketch. It says ligne Boche at the top, ligne des tranchées, poste d'observation, de l'artillerie, téléphone, and the dotted lines are the telephone lines. And this is an interpreter who assisted during Lowlevel. We have a British unit taking over from a French unit, if my memory is correct, and the interpreter was there to make sure that this went smoothly. And so we have It starts with this section. À 2h du matin, réveillé par l'arrivée des téléphonistes de l'infanterie française, il fait froid mais un beau clair de lune. Je sors dans la cour avec eux et leur fais voir leur installation pour eux et leurs appareils. Quel débrouillard. En un clin d'œil, ils sont chez eux et se font servir du thé chaud par les Anglais, échangeant quelques bibelots contre des pots de confiture et des cigarettes. So that's the first stage. And then the next stage happens. En compagnie de l'officier artilleur anglais, je retrouve la plaine et me rends au quartier général d'artillerie où nous trouvons les officiers d'artillerie française en conférence avec le colonel, je pense, d'artillerie anglaise. Je pars avec le capitaine de la batterie française et ses 2 acolytes, un téléphoniste et un maréchal des logis, et le capitaine artilleur anglais. Je marche entre deux et fais l'English spoken. That's an interesting one because what he's actually doing is interpreting. But that's something which is so rare in his daily tasks that it's actually mentioned. This is something, I talk about these people as military interpreters, but actually standing between people and passing bits of language backwards and forwards is something that he did so rarely that it's mentioned. A lot of what these people did is what nowadays their job description is fixers. The US Army in Iraq, what they have is fixers. Journalists have fixers. These are people who solve our problems on the ground. They may do interpreting, what we consider actual formal interpreting, but most of what they do may well be independent work, language work, communication work, on their own or with other people. So this is an interpreter who has to point out the fact that he is actually interpreting at this point. And then we get the rest of the account of this relève. Les artilleurs ont plus à se dire que les fantassins. Visite de la cuisine qui est dans un talus, de la batterie qui est dans un autre talus. Inspection des canons d'études et de la carte. Explication à l'officier anglais qu'une batterie française ne se pointe pas de la même façon qu'une batterie anglaise. Les Anglais prennent un axe pour toute la batterie et tirent à divers angles de cet axe. Les Français prennent un axe pour chaque canon. De plus, les Anglais comptent les distances en yards et nous en mètres, les angles en degrés, minutes et secondes et nous en millièmes. D'où tâche assez compliquée pour l'interprète, mais heureusement l'officier d'artillerie français est d'une intelligence rare et d'une vivacité inouïe. Il prend l'initiative et pose des questions nettes avec la précision propre à son métier. Another case of this guy is an interpreter, but he ends up doing very technical tasks in this relève because he's the man who happens to be there when they realise that you don't just have to pass language from one to the other, and it's actually far more complicated. So it gives us another dimension of the job, and it means I have a neat. I'll do that later. Again, remember this guy was not trained for what he was doing. And the second case of fighting together that I wanted to discuss with you is this one. Now this is a letter by a guy called Théophile, Lavenard, who was an instituteur, not an official interpreter. And he writes, dans ce secteur-là, nous sommes en contact avec l'armée anglaise et naturellement j'ai renouvelé un peu connaissance avec John Bull. J'ai été vu, faut-il croire, à plusieurs reprises conversant avec les Alliés et on a utilisé maintes fois ma connaissance relative de l'anglais. Même que cela a failli me jouer un mauvais tour, le commandant m'avait emmené avec lui pour lui servir d'interprète bénévole. Nous étions dans un gourbi habité par des sommités anglaises, auprès desquelles se trouvait notre colonel et son officier adjoint. Quand le commandant a été en possession des renseignements qu'il désirait, il a pris congé et nous sommes sortis. À peine 3 ou 4 minutes s'étaient écoulées quand un obus de fort calibre, placé comme avec la main, est entré dans le gourbi anglais par une fenêtre mal bouchée et y a tué notre colonel, son officier et un anglais. Plusieurs autres ont été blessés ou contusionnés. Il était dans le temps. Now that's the kind of source that I spent a lot of my PhD looking for because, I knew I had official military interpreters, but what happened in the many situations when there wasn't one? Well, this is the kind of thing that happened. There was somebody who happened to speak English and then he got used to do whatever interpreting was needed. That's something which, as a historian, I can't quantify at all. I've got several examples of it happening, but that's about as good as I can be. It clearly happened. But the interesting thing is when we look at I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but this is the extract from the GMO, the Journal de Marche et Opération of the regiment, which tells us about the same incident, which obviously has no mention at all of interpreting and language things happening. So this is an interesting case where we can see there was someone there who fulfilled an actual language and communication task, but it's something which does not appear at all in the official account. So it's one of those cases where I have to try to squeeze the meaning out of the examples that I have, because it's the kind of ephemeral sources that are hard to deal with. Now, I'm winding up towards the end. I'm not going to do this in detail, but one of the many things that struck me when I was working on this is that fighting together, yes, it's organizing movements between troops, yes, it's organizing exchanges between officers, but it's also an awful lot of paperwork. And this is an example. Jacques Bardou, who ended up being a politician afterwards, was a French military interpreter during the First World War. And this is a case where he does written translation. There's an awful lot of written translation being done at this point. I'll do this quickly for you, but basically we've got an original in English, then we've got his first handwritten translation, and then we've got the official translation which he passed on to his superiors. An awful lot of these people were doing translation of the paperwork that goes with modern warfare. I'm always impressed when I go to Vincennes. The amount of paperwork that modern warfare generates is very, very impressive. And I don't think anybody has ever written on the amount of paperwork that warfare generates, and somebody really needs to. Somebody really needs to. And obviously my interpreters and other people who happen to have language skills were people who were caught in the middle of this, because all these reports that got sent from one headquarter to the next, once they ended up having to be sent to the Allies, they needed to be translated. So that's something which is, again, not necessarily easy to write about, but clearly an important factor. Right, and I shall in 5 minutes wind up about changing natures of warfare in 1918. The entry of the United States into the war on the side of the Allies in 17, but it really makes an impact in 18, changed many things on the Western Front, not least as far as languages are concerned. John Horn has argued, I think convincingly, but I need to figure out the maths again, that in 1918 there were more Anglophone than Francophone soldiers between the Channel and the Swiss border, which is not something that French historiography of the First World War tends to underline. And there's two things I want to look at with you for the year of 1918, which have to do with the arrival of the Americans and then with the changing back to the war of movement. Now, this is a postcard sent by a French military interpreter, him I think, or him, of his first day of being a military interpreter in Le Havre. There was basically a holding camp in Le Havre where people who had been selected to be interpreters got sent, and where they waited for new British units that would need an interpreter and then got attached to them. So that was where they waited. That's them in the evening at dinner. And that's basically how it worked. If you were newly selected as interpreter, you got sent to Le Havre, and then you waited, and then after a while you got sent to a unit. When the Americans arrive, the first thing they ask for, basically the structures get duplicated. There'd been a mission militaire française auprès de l'armée britannique, so there's now one auprès de l'armée américaine aussi, as well. And what happens is the first thing the American army with the mission militaire française put in place is a training school for the military interpreters. New idea. So this gets set up in late 1917 for the interpreters that would be serving alongside the American army. There isn't any official justification of why they set up this training school. It may be something to do with how the American army at that point trained, which was a lot by institutionalized training, because it was a new army and they needed to train a lot of people from zero. Essentially. So that may be why. But anyway, when the Mission Militaire Française auprès de l'Armée Britannique gets wind of this, they say, oh, that's a good idea. In 1918, they set up a training school, which opens in April 1918, better late than never, and they set up a training school for military interpreters. So this is a picture of one of the first classes that went through this training school, which was in Berck-sur-Mer. And we have accounts on the French side, on the American side, Jean Norton Cru, that some of you may have heard of because he wrote extensively about literary témoignages and other things, had been an interpreter with the British and then ended up teaching in the training school for interpreters alongside the Americans. And he, in his letters, which have been published, writes quite extensively about his experience of teaching, how he teaches and what he teaches. And on the for the training school for the British side, we don't have an account by a teacher, but we do have several accounts by people who followed these classes, so who went to them. So I've got at least one set of handwritten notes where an interpreter went to this class, and they learn vocabulary, they learn military vocabulary, they learn things like, you know, ranks in the other army. But we're looking at a stage late on in the war where they tend to be what they call cours de perfectionnement. So these are people who've already been doing the job on the ground for a long time, and they then get sent for 2 or 3 weeks to these schools. On the American side, it's a bit different because some of them are recruited from zero, but for the British Army, most of these tend to be what they call cours de perfectionnement, where they're improving people who already have been doing the job. Now, and yes, so that's what I wanted to say about basically the institutionalization of language provision for the First World War. It's interesting that it changes with the arrival of the Americans, and it's something which is difficult to prove, but I think not just for languages, but for quite a lot of questions, the arrival of the Americans changes things because things that had been established whichever way at the beginning of the war on a very temporary basis start to be questioned. A lot of things change in 1918, I think, because they are questioned. When the Americans arrive, the question is, will we be doing it the same way or should we be doing it differently? So a lot of things like formalizing training, not just for interpreters in fact, change with the arrival of the Americans, and something which as handling of a war which was expected to be however short, but certainly shorter than it ended up being, is the degree of formalization is interesting, and it comes very suddenly in late 17, early 1918. But it is an interesting fact that there were 2 official training schools that trained all these interpreters. I've been avoiding throughout this paper to say how many interpreters there were because I'm still not 100% sure, but the figure I tend to give is about 6,000 if we count the ones alongside the British plus the ones alongside the Americans. It shifts a bit because some people are interpreters at the beginning of the war and get sent back to their units, so it shifts it around a bit, but I reckon about 6,000 is probably right. So that's quite a big number of people who have an official designation as an interpreter. When you think that most histories of interpreting tend to start with possibly Versailles and Paul Montou and then really go into conference interpreting, but sort of these numbers of people formally designated as interpreters rarely are mentioned. Now, I said I wanted to talk about the war of movement starting again. I'm going to be very brief on that, but it's something where military interpreters alongside British units played an important role. In spring 1918, when the Germans do their last big advance, I've picked you a quotation. This is from what the French army called the carnet de notes. All these military interpreters had a little booklet where their superiors, mostly the British officers, but sometimes the French officier de liaison, wrote down evaluations of their work, so which is a great source for me, obviously. And here's one from spring 1918. It says, alors que la localité était soumise à un violent bombardement, donc l'interprète, est allé chercher dans les caves où elle s'était réfugiée plus de 30 personnes et a réussi à les évacuer toutes 2 heures avant que l'ennemi pénétrât dans le village. So that's the kind of thing we're looking at. You know, we talked about interpreters behind the lines and, you know, negotiating about onions and meals. But I mean, these are the kind of tasks that then in 1918, with movement starting up again, start to become urgent. So it works that way, but it also works the other way. When the Allied advance really starts from the summer of 1918, we're then looking at a situation where villages that had been under German occupation throughout the whole war are being liberated. And who handles this? The interpreters handle this. And there's actually a guideline document which is set up in the summer of 1918 and given to all the interpreters on how to handle this. And it includes things like, you know, find out who the mayor is. If the mayor was in place before the First World War, it's fine, you can leave him. But if the Germans put him in place, you make sure this mayor leaves and we find a new one. So it's interesting that we then have the interpreter who is now an agent of the French state, because these are French people being liberated by British troops, but you need to make sure that, you know, the French state has control into there. So they then end up having these kind of roles and all sorts of other jobs, like we're talking about a period of Spanish flu, so they end up having lots of people who are ill in villages that are very hard to reach and need to be evacuated. Great problems in getting food there. Plus one picture that I love. This I found in the Imperial War Museum funds. This is the Hôtel de Ville in Douai. And this is a French military interpreter who is replacing the British flag, which had been hung up the day before when the British troops entered Douai, with a French flag. Because he didn't get there with the very first troops, he got there with the second round the next day. And so the first thing he does is he takes down the British flag and puts up the French flag, which, considering other pictures of similar flags that we all know, is an interesting one. Right, I'm going to conclude in about 3 minutes, and then I should be done, I think. Yes. I brought back my favourite quotation, Marcel Mauss. I hope I've given you a vague idea, at least, of how that kind of exchange of 8,000 spades between divisions every time that a French division got swapped out against the British division. I hope to have given you a slight idea of how that kind of communication could have happened. And I would like, sort of basically this, how the communication happened on an institutional level with the setting up of a liaison service of individuals, which, as I said, is not something which we usually trace that early in history, especially with the professional setup and training schools, and then also on the more informal side, with this kind of code or servir or whatever we like to call it, that happened behind the front lines. And so those are my basic answers to the sort of the communication question, the language question. How did they talk to each other? What about the history question, the question on why the Allied coalition was a durable success, essentially? There are several ways of answering that question. One is looking at the debriefing after the war. The British Army, the French Army and the American Army both wrote documents after the First World War evaluating how the language system had worked. And they all basically reached the conclusion that there were minute details that could be changed, but essentially it worked. The British don't, but they then make choices at the beginning of the Second World War that mean we can infer things, but I won't get into that. I think there are 5 elements which add up to an answer to the history question, essentially. First of all, that's something I said several times, the pre-1914 military language setups were very different in Britain, France and Britain, but they were eminently compatible. Which is something which comes from different colonial experience, but the fact that a British officer would have felt at ease being given a native guide, if that's what we're going to call them, the fact that for the French Army it made sense to recruit individuals with specialist skills and put them into specialist tasks. These two practices together meant that neither army was confronted with a major challenge of its prior mode of functioning. Secondly, that's something I haven't got into today really, but the men who drew up the solution, including the 1905, 1906 and then the 1911 plans, were people who had extensive language knowledge themselves. There's a couple of individuals that end up being pivotal for all the pre-war planning, and they're people who spoke lots of languages, had lots of experience as military attachés and elsewhere, and I think that has an important impact on the kind of planning they can do. Thirdly, I think the fact that these French military interpreters who served along the British troops were recruited with no prior training to be interpreters, and no corporate identity, if you want, as interpreters that they needed to defend before the war, led to a high degree of pragmatism, as in it just had to sort of work, which I think probably made a certain number of tense situations easier to solve. On a similar note, what I mentioned about the balance of power in intercultural communication situations and the question of hierarchy. Language means power, but in this case, quite often, the man with the language power, the interpreter, didn't have the hierarchical power that the British officer would have had. So I didn't show you that example, but I can come back to that if people are interested. I think the fact that language power and hierarchical power were kind of balanced each other out in quite a lot of these communication situations was probably one of the reasons it all worked fairly smoothly. And finally, one fact that is this due to the language setup of the First World War, the fact that the same language pair served for both military liaison and exchanges with the civilians probably made things a lot easier. Say, if modern day troops, when they were in Afghanistan, it wasn't the same language on the ground with the locals as amongst coalition partners. In this case, it was, which meant it was easier as far as logistics goes, because the interpreter who was busy sorting out whether there were onions in the meal could also be sent to work out a first-line task. And it was also important, that's something I haven't spoken about, but a lot of these interpreters had struggled to define their role in this war, because they felt they weren't doing a sufficiently military task. They got accused of being embusqués, and being able to consider that even if they themselves weren't doing something incredibly military and brave, they could be and they might be, and other interpreters were. I think is something which really helped them and made the whole setup more stable and more successful, both logistically and as far as the individuals were concerned. And that's it. Thank you.